One thing I think that I think that the cybernetics might have got a bit of a bad name as a result of that Adam Curtis documentary, where he did actually make a mistake in conflating the cybernetics view of the world with the artificial intelligence view of the world, and they are quite different in that artificial intelligence, and you know, if you look at the history of trying to make sense of the processes of cognition, artificial intelligence, you know, to summarize in a really bastardized way, would seek to replicate cognition by mimicking every single one of the processes that is observed in the brain. For example, trying to replicate every single neuron and thinking that simply from that you'd give rise to a process of perception. Whereas actually the cybernetics approach was always about modeling goals. So what is the goal of this thing, and how do we sort of go meta, if you like. And so in a sense, I actually think that the cybernetics approach does do that sort of meta, matter to meta, if you like. Certainly the second order cyberneticians who kind of came around in the 70s. Yeah. And of course, the thing that is interesting to me, especially in the light of people like Cedric Price, and is the work with Gordon Pask, of course, who's also a cybernetician. So that was one thing to raise from there. Yeah, I suppose I'd start from there.
All right. Natalie, I was also wondering how you are dealing with the dark matter in your projects. Can you shed some light on that, please?
Well, it's stunning for me that Dan actually took the opportunity to talk about it, because one of the unsaid secrets about dark matter is it's boring to talk about, right? And I can tell you that in producing every single one of my projects, like the pharmacy project was a very simple first stage of it, which is these ag bags. I didn't say that the little facade that I did in Chelsea was only small plants, even though it took an enormous amount of work to get that physically up, literally rappelling up and down. It's a great way to farm, by rappelling. If anyone's a rock climber / urban farmer, you know, let's do it. But it was it actually earned me a Class 1 violation of the Department of Buildings, and I went to court for it. Which is actually next to being put in jail. A Class 1 violation is just about, you know, big construction firms don't do this when they kill people, right? When I got a Class 1 violation for and you know, it's interesting. I went to court and managed to convince the particular judge, so a sympathetic judge, that, you know, with begging and pleading, some explanation that could she please let me off the many thousands of dollars fine, and the whole thing was because I didn't have a permit for this facade. And when I asked her, they let me off. It was only a few $100 fine that I had to pay. But when I asked her, well, you know, please advise me, what permit should I use? And she said, there isn't a permit. Of course. So it's actually then, since we've been going through what there is, there's many permits for advertising. So the only way this new stage of the pharmacy project with these ag bags is actually to follow through and to make them advertising. Basically, these are advertising. So I'm working with various, manufacturing facilities and businesses that need new signs. And we just, you know, print the signs onto the Tyvek, and they're also ag bags, right? So it's sort of, I think, this way of these explorations. You know, it's just not fun to talk about going to court. I mean, I've got or where or how you spectacularize the incredible amount of work that goes into just, you know, with their fish buoys. Harmless little fish buoys, 7 city, state, and federal agencies involved in giving permission, not any help, not just in facility. And I can't, you know, multiply that. You know, for each agency, it's an exponential relationship with number of meetings, and you know, so it's the sort of work that is very hard to to make visible, very hard to interest people in, and critical to expose. And so I thank you for doing so, and I feel like perhaps there are actually real strategies in doing so. So finally, I think the ooze, many of the animal projects I actually call ooze, zoo backwards and without cages, to reframe it in a familiar institutional term, because I think the great cultural legacy of conceptual art versus artists working in this area versus designers is maybe the only intellectual legacy of conceptual art of the 20th century is institutional critique, which is a fundamentally useful way that, in fact, to produce, and it's certainly with artists that was focused on the museums, critiquing the museums and the collections and things. But I think there are a lot of really interesting strategies that have come out of the practice of institutional critique that are absent from the vocabulary of the designer because of the service structure of design, that you actually do it for clients and you do it for...
To compliant with
yeah.
what the client wants, you mean?
Exactly. So you don't have to question or reframe or rethink the institution or call yourself an environmental health clinic and or whatever. You don't have to in design or invent on that. Oh, you haven't had to. And I think the calling and describing the strategy is important.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, respond, please. And then I want to give the audience a chance to pose some more questions too.
I think it hadn't occurred to me in those terms that this shift, when I was a designer working in a consultancy, then it was very difficult to do this work. I think because of that client-consultant relationship. And actually, we're working at Citra now, we're designers, but we have no clients. We're a public body, so we don't need to have in that sense. And in fact, you go out and you find people who might be interested, and it's not at all a client relationship. Like I said, with the city council, when we're talking about, maybe we host a dinner with people from the 4 departments. We just talk it through about how we could make this better. By taking the money off the table that would otherwise be there, it makes it a very easy conversation. I mean, I think there's something very interesting and problematic about the consultant relationship that stops a lot of that work. And it's why I think the design thinking movement is just a dead duck, because it's in a consultant model, and I just don't think it could ever get at the things that are outside of the client-consultant relationship, but they're probably the problem in a way. So I think, and it also makes me, the institutional critique stuff I now need to go away and understand a lot more about, because we're looking at strategies. This kind of idea is, how do you find the right vocabulary, or how do you sidestep? We have a technique called the Maginot Line, which is after the German army going round the French defences in World War II rather than going through them. So you kind of Maginot Lined your way around the fact there wasn't a permit for the ag bags by using advertising instead, which is really smart thing to do. So we need to kind of understand and make legible these kind of plays or techniques or strategies, I think. Now he's gone.
Okay, thank you. Is there someone in the audience who still wants to or has a question for Usman or Natalie or Dan and really wants to pose it? This is your chance. You got your question again.
I got my question back. And actually, what do you think can this new media or this new technology contribute to creating this culture of failure or getting people to move about all the stuff we talked about? Because actually, from my opinion, just to challenge you a bit, I think that it doesn't really add much. If you put the same discussion 200 years before, you would probably been in the same situation, or not.
I don't even know how to answer that one. I think, well, I'll say the first bit. The new media technologies, I mean, I'm a new media designer. That's my background as a designer, I suppose. So I do think they have a role to play. I just, they're not the point, if you see what I mean. They're not the driver for it either. And I think sometimes when we've embarked on our brick starter stuff, then people have sometimes misinterpreted it. It's because the technology enables you now to crowdsource things. And actually, I think there's a deeper cultural driver behind, say, crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, which yes, the technology enables, but it's not the driver for necessarily, and I think we can confuse those enablers and drivers a little bit. So I think, yes, they have a profound role to play, but as a tool, as an enabler, rather than being a kind of a motivation in itself, if you see what I mean.
Thanks. Damon, go ahead.
No one else wants to go? Sorry, my voice is a little bit gone, but I always think of the world as there are two things you can do. You can decide to change the system from the inside out or change it from outside and just build a completely new system. And in a way, you're claiming that we have to rebuild the system, right, and use creativity and design in that. To me, that almost seems like you're asking me to become, part of that 83%, to become not just a designer, but also a lawyer, maybe, or a politician, and that we have to, as designers, go into that world and, go through that drudgery. But maybe that will finally change it. Until Natalie spoke, I saw her as a proponent of the other side of the equation of going outside of the system and saying, I'm an artist, I'm just going to do this wacky thing, and it's going to change your perception of the world. Although, you are also clearly deal with maneuvering inside the system as well. So I was wondering how you see that dichotomy and what role, what of the two roads is probably a good place to go. And Usman might even be like a middle ground between being like a technology road. I don't know.
We arranged the seating accordingly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I relish that part of the conversation in projects. I think when we did Flight Path Toronto, having to deal with the safety inspectors, that whole process, which was, yes, it was a really frustrating aspect of it, but I actually do enjoy having to place things in a context and in terms that these kind of people can understand and actually kind of appreciate and enjoy in the project. This doesn't mean that they always do. Or when I used to do sort of big, massive balloon projects, having to get permission from aircraft control to fly these structures and to, apply for the correct permit. And because this is the thing, you can always hack the system. And so when the question is posed of whether one works within the system to change it or from outside of it, I think it's a false dichotomy, because we're oscillations. I mean, I hate to use ever more analogies on top of it, but we are these kind of oscillations that find no fixed place within it, and it's only through the jostling in the system, sort of finding ourselves at times in different positions within it, that I think it kind of propels it forward. And that also reminds me a little bit of, and also following on from what you're talking about, the sort of the troubling client relationship. Just in this context, it might be dangerous to say this, but my brother is actually in hedge funds. And he's a bit of an activist, I suppose you could say, in the field, because he does find it incredibly problematic. And he said something very interesting to me recently, which is comparable to the complaint that designers often make, that, look, I can't do good stuff because these clients ask for really stupid things. And he basically said, there is a problem in the banking industry and the hedge fund industry, that the investors just want stupid stuff. They just want to make money. They want the biggest, fastest buck. And, if we don't give them that, then we don't get work. And so, it points so much to this, to needing to challenge the very structure that determines that kind of relationship.
Can I just add to that quick answer? Because I really just don't think there is any out there. There is no position outside to be an independent actor, as much as the lack of funding and other things, the privilege of not having kind of organizational structure as an independent artist may look like you're acting independently in any way to work in this context. But I think to connect the technology is politics by another means, as Latour famously says. The question before, to conflate it, is there is a strategic or tactical, Dan, you can correct my military terms, but a tactical opportunity in using new technologies, and that is that they are new. Right, and so they have less ossified institutional structure around them. There's a kind of whiz-bangery, I love The Wizard of Oz, a great hero of mine, reference that the marvelous dramaturgy relationship project was presented. There's some particular things about technology versus policy innovation or design is that it's both, irreducibly complex, but it also it has a kind of you can hide behind it, right, and exploit that, and it also has unintended consequences. So it's also always and already uncontrolled, and so many of those things make new technology a really a really fertile opportunity to kind of seize that moment where people are fascinated with cell phones or fascinated with real-time geolocated information, and and Trojan horse it, to use another one of your term. Use the MacGuffin to Trojan horse to. It's I think one of the best strategies I can think of.
I'm taking two last questions, one from Kars and one from Martijn to close off. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've heard a few of you talk about the kind of the hopelessness of doing design in a client services context, or to some extent to do kind of design for social change in that context at least. But at the same time, for instance, I think perhaps the Netherlands needs something like Citra, and when I hear you speak about the opportunity, or an environmental health clinic, I get kind of jealous. On the other hand, I think perhaps throwing the baby out with the bathwater, saying client services design for social change doesn't work, is a bit too extreme as well. So I was wondering if you could comment on perhaps opportunities to hybridize these practices, or in general how to set up an organization within which you as a designer can actually deal with that 83% that is important. So kind of move up one level from the individual designer to organizations within which a designer can function to actually affect change. What do those look like?
I think there's a lot of innovation required in the kind of the idea of practice and organizations that designers are often bound to. For instance, in Rory Hyde, who's just here, has just written a very good book about architectural practice and potential futures for it, which is coming to a bookshop near you in May or something. There you go.
Thanks for that.
Which has a series of kind of speculative interviews. I think Natalie is one of them, and Matt Webb from Berg, but otherwise there's a lot of architects in there as well. And it's interesting when you move across the spectrum of 12 or so different pieces, I don't know how many, you see this, all of them kind of struggling to varying degrees with trying to find a way out of the very tight. Architecture probably has the tightest client relationship in a way, because they've never found a way of making their own product outside of a developer or a builder, usually. Whereas a company like Berg, I guess, for example, is interesting, or Usman, even when you have a service or a product that you're leading yourself, it can provide a bit of income and room for maneuver such that you can then afford to have some R&D or something. And you find an R&D project which then becomes a client project and vice versa. And it's, architects really only have competitions to play with in that respect, and they're usually unpaid and and so on. So I think it's very interesting to look at the position of being a designer and then try and figure out the room for maneuver to look at those things that would work outside of the client relationship, particularly when, as I think I tried to posit, that the clients sometimes just don't exist for the problems that we now have. Or sometimes there's one client, but you need 5 of them, or sometimes you're talking to 6 clients, but it's the amalgamation of all of them, or something else that you need, because the problems have changed. And so we are left with this problem now in terms of that consultancy relationship. Now, not to say that you can't do it, I just think it's incredibly hard, and it's so wasteful as a way of working. There's too much attrition involved, and then therefore people don't really go for the genuine question that's being asked outside of what it says in the contract, because it's just too difficult to do that, and that seems to me not good enough in a way. So we do work with consultants. I have worked as a design consultant and as a designer inside and outside of organizations, small ones and big ones and so on, and it's been interesting to observe that, but the level of independence we have now I think is quite important to what we're able to do at the moment. It's not the only model by any means, but Rory's book has a few more in there.
Actually, I'd like to just pick that up as well. When I founded my design practice as an architect, I very explicitly didn't want to do the thing where you do commissions and then you have a little bit of cash so you can do the R&D. I wanted actually, from the beginning, to do the research and for that to be commissioned, to become commissioned, if you see what I mean. And so one of the decisions I made, which I haven't stuck to perfectly, but one of the decisions I made was that I would almost always try and get hired by a client without doing a proposal. So to get a commitment that we're going to work together so we can collaboratively come up with something. And so that would happen in the bigger projects especially that would sometimes take 2 or 3 years. I would say, you know, because I think that one of our biggest cultural problems now is the architectural competition, which you referred to, because so many thousands or tens of thousands of human hours are expended on these things on the basis of selecting one that may get built. And I think they're absolutely, they're anti-human.
So no more bids and competitions for you.
And so, you know, so for example, Patch Bay was actually, it was a spin-off from my design company, which was that attempt to create something that goes meta. It becomes the thing that, maybe it's not exactly dark matter stuff, but you know, that it can have an impingement on that side of things.
Yeah. Natalie, do you have a comment on the sort of organization type that designers could?
Yeah, I was actually trained by IDEO design. I actually did a degree with David Kelly, and I started my conflict, a long conflict, as a student. He actually threw me out of 2 classes, which because you know the social and political interests that I had that he didn't think were relevant to the class discussion. So you know it was quite friendly, but it was an interesting lesson for me of how allergic I am to that kind of service structure of design, and who's responsible, you know, for, you know, and if there's any role that an artist has, particularly when it comes to complex ecological or scientific or technical phenomena, is that no one trusts an artist. You know, no one's going to pay you money to do something. No one, you know, wants to see your degrees, or you know, they just don't believe you, right? And you're only ever as persuasive as what you can get done and what you can make evident. And so I think that actually is a very interesting intellectual discipline on the kind of work that becomes feasible. Whereas, you know, with these fantastical budgets and tremendous design teams and a lot of CAD monkeys, you can do great drawings that, you know, don't really enlist or engage or aren't tremendously legible. Whereas kind of physically trying to do experiments and prototypes and public experiments, because you don't have the kind of private experimental resources, you know, that everything gets done in public, it's transparent. If, you know, can a tree own itself, and can you run a tree office? I don't know. Well, you know, we'll find out, and I may or may not be, you know. So it's just, I think the capacity to kind of fail in public and have no kind of respect or credibility is actually, again, I think sort of artist versus designer is quite useful, because of course you stand in for the everyman, because we all don't feel kind of particularly expert, or and that I think is what we need in a market-based participatory democracy, where the kind of the aggregation of processes and policies and expertise can, you know, feel indomitable.
All right. Shall we go to the last question, Martijn?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks all 3 of you for your contributions for the day. And I think I saw an interesting line emerge through the program that we maybe even hadn't quite planned. But we started off talking about how do you organize communities or publics around issues. And Usman and Natalie gave some great examples of that, and in the project presentations as well. And later in the afternoon, we moved almost more to city making and even society making and the design of that. And what struck me is that that one of my first slides this morning, I started with Archigram, and I started with them for a reason, because when we talk about city making, traditionally we think of architects, as the ones who make a city or who come up with maybe the big plans or the manifestos or et cetera, et cetera. But in most of the talks today, even though we're talking about the city, I think I've only heard the word architecture in the sentence, the architecture of the problem, and not so much in, as them contributing to this whole development. So my final question was, Usman, you've been trained an architect, then you've worked a lot with architects. What can be the role of the architect in all these developments that we've been talking today?
Usman, would you like to begin? Trained as an architect?
Whoa. I did write a pamphlet called Death of the Architect in 1992, in which I didn't foresee a role. No, I think that one of the questions that was posed at the beginning of the day was, are there strategies from the online world that can be exported to the physical world? And I would be very worried if architects took that approach, because I think that one of the things we see in the online world is an increasing homogeneity, right? You go to Facebook to see your friends, you come across the stuff you're looking for, you don't actually, not like it used to be, huh? Where you'd sort of like go down dark alleys on the internet and go, whoa, how did I get here? And actually, that's kind of nice, and so in a sense, but what we are seeing instead is, instead of the online world strategies being exported to architecture, it seems more like people who are doing stuff online starting to think about the physical world, which is a different thing altogether. And I think it ties very much in to a notion of architecture as process rather than as physical static fabric. And in that world, what does an architect do? I mean, the whole question of what an architect actually is, besides having that little sort of, depending on what country you are, the little initials after your name, I think that gets quite radically transformed.
As the non-architect, I actually see a very clear future for architects, and I think all the participatory processes that have been developed that have invited people into charrettes and have kind of popularized the job of kind of designing the city and the urban infrastructure, the built environment, has served to kind of underscore how radically important the skills of architects are, right? Because it's very hard to kind of crystallize material designs. But I think with tweaking the institutions within which architects work and whom they are working for, right? So it's not just the rich developer, it's actually the methods on which they're, in my Long Island City, where I've been, issued this new urban plan, anything goes. Building code has been lifted and anything goes, as long as it measurably improves environmental health. So holding architects to actually doing anything, as long as it can improve the shared environmental commons, the air quality, I think would be really interesting and exciting to see what and how that gets produced, in addition to kind of reinventing their client as not, a developer, but perhaps a consortium, building or designing the process through which they are, who they're delivering what to, I think is really sort of restates what Dan's calling for, is that it becomes part of the design job. So I see a bright and rosy and critical future for architects.
All right. Are you going to take the middle position, Dan, or you refrain from commenting?
Well, I think that, I could carry on waffling on forever, but that was a nice place to stop in a way, I think. But
okay,
just quickly, I think I'm in the four of us at Citra Strategic Design Unit. I'm the interaction designer, service designer type. The other three are all architects, and I learn a lot more from them than they probably get from me. But all of that stuff that you saw today is our attempt, in a way, to kind of weld design practice to these other goals or outcomes or situations, or maybe the ones that always have been the goals of design practice, but they can never get near it. And so I think it applies to architecture, absolutely, but I think that generally also design, industrial design, interaction design, service design, a lot of the other design practices are all facing a similar situation, but also a similar trajectory. The one that Natalie just outlined, where that becomes part of the design job as well, I think is open to actually all the design professions, and just as necessary as there is in architecture.
Yeah. The role of any expert, basically, that is now changing. All right, I wish to thank all the keynote speakers very much for your last contribution.